It's a good arrangement. It gets around any congressional issues, even though there is a notification requirement. What I'd like to see is that aid increase, and it appears today that instead of 2 Patriot systems, they may well be providing 5 Patriot systems to Ukraine under this latest announcement.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by Major General Mick Ryan. Mick served with the Australian Army for more than 30 years. He's a senior fellow for military studies at the Lowy Institute and adjunct fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. His latest book is called The War for Ukraine. Mick, great to see you again. Thanks for joining us on Frontline.
Great to talk to you.
Yeah, Mick, now that Putin has just short of 50 days before Donald Trump's threatened sanctions and secondary tariffs on those who trade with Russia, how do you think he will use that time?
Well, I think in the first instance, he will be using it to do as much harm as he possibly can to Ukraine. He has certainly accelerated the aerial attacks against Ukraine with these 400, 500, 700 drone raids each night into Ukraine, and the production of those drones, particularly the Russian variant, is continuing to increase with the support of Iran and China. So I expect we'll see him step up. He would like to be able to step up his ground operations, but it's difficult to see whether he'll be able to do that. And in some respects, I think the accelerated air campaign is to make up for insufficient progress, not no progress, but insufficient progress in the 2025 summer offensive.
Also, is it as much as to cause as much psychological damage and physical damage in the time and conditions that permit it?
Oh, absolutely. I think a lot of Ukrainian people just see this as another 50 days where Ukraine can increase their suffering, and Putin clearly will do that. He has been happy to do that since the beginning of the war. He has absolutely no empathy for the Ukrainian people. He awarded medals to those who perpetrated the war crimes around Bucha. So, increasing the mental suffering and heartache of the Ukrainian people, nurturing an environment where they would prefer to leave the country. Putin would be happy with that. And also nurturing thoughts in Ukrainian peoples where they don't trust their leaders to defend them. This is all part of Putin's design.
It's been reported that Putin had told Donald Trump a little while ago that he planned to keep up the offensive for 2 months. Why would he do that? And why would he put a timing on it?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know whether that's actually the case. We see a lot of reporting of things that are supposed to have been said. I find it hard to believe that Putin would have actually said this to Trump. I mean, I'm sure he may have said he's going to continue with the war. Clearly, Trump hasn't been able to dissuade him from it. But putting a timeline on it doesn't kind of ring true to me. So, I look at that reporting and kind of go, I'd have to be pretty skeptical that that's what he actually said.
How optimistic are you about the agreement announced by Donald Trump for other NATO allies to purchase US military equipment so they can send their own to Ukraine, because it fulfills Donald Trump's transactional needs while potentially providing Ukraine with what it needs?
Yeah, I think this is probably about as good as Ukraine can expect from American military assistance at the moment. It works, clearly, because the Americans aren't providing aid. They're selling weapons, and that's never been a problem for US administrations in the past, certainly not to NATO countries. So it works for NATO to be able to backfill stocks they'd given to Ukraine. It helps them to provide additional assistance to Ukraine. I mean, we've seen something very similar where the Ukrainians sell artillery munitions to the US, so the US could provide munitions to Ukraine. So I think it's a good arrangement. It gets around any congressional issues, even though there is a notification requirement. What I'd like to see is that aid increase, and it appears today that instead of 2 Patriot systems, they may well be providing 5 Patriot systems to Ukraine under this latest announcement.
And what do you know about the detail of the other equipment? How much of it is defensive, do you know, and how much of it is potentially offensive military equipment?
Well, I mean, most military equipment can be used for both. I mean, Patriot's probably unique in that it's not. It's really a defensive system. There was some intimation from Trump about battlefield munitions, so artillery, that clearly has both defensive and offensive uses. We really don't know the details beyond the air defence systems. And my sense probably is that's where Trump's head is anyway, in the air defence. That's what it appears that his wife is badgering him about. Thank you for that, Melania. So I think that's probably going to be the priority, and it is the priority for the Ukrainians. That is where they're suffering at the moment, and that's where US military assistance can really help.
It is a priority, but time is also of the essence, isn't it? How soon will it provide new extra weaponry other than that which had already been held up?
Well, I think this is where sending it to NATO so NATO can give Ukraine its material will help. I mean, there are still NATO countries that have Patriot missile launch systems, Patriot missiles that they could potentially give to Ukraine that they've been keeping as an emergency reserve for themselves. So they may now be able to provide that, given that the Americans are going to backfill stocks. It's a question whether the stuff the Americans are going to provide to NATO is new build, which may take time, or is from existing US Army stocks in Europe or in the continental United States. We don't know that level of detail just yet.
Because it all sounds very good, doesn't it? But then you think it could take months potentially.
Yeah, it does sound good, like Australia giving main battle tanks to Ukraine. That sounded great last year, and they're still yet to arrive. So the devil is in the detail. And as you said, in war, when you're defending against these kind of onslaughts from the Russians, time is of the essence. Every day Ukrainians die.
And what effect do you think Trump's threats to impose tariffs and sanctions will have on China, both materially but also politically, in its relationships with the US and Russia?
Yeah, I think this is the most fascinating dimension of these threatened tariffs or secondary sanctions, sorry. The tariffs on Russia don't mean anything. There's only $3 billion in trade at the moment, so that's not going to change Russia's behaviour. China is the major economic enabler and provider of dual-use material to Russia at the moment. So secondary sanctions on them, which the Americans and everyone else has shied away from up until now, could be a really significant consideration for Xi. However, the real question I think we need to answer is this: does Trump have more will to impose these sanctions on China than Xi has to help Russia not lose the war? At the moment, I think Xi will see it as more important to keep Russia in the war than to roll over to the Americans. But you just never know how things may pan out.
And you also write in a recent Substack that China has been looking at how it can benefit from the prolonged war, and you analyse that quite in depth. Strategically, what does it gain?
Well, it gains a whole lot of things actually by the prolonging of the war. Unfortunately, it increases the suffering of the Ukrainian people. But what it does, it keeps Europe in Europe, particularly with the current Trump administration's policy, with the Europeans leading on the war. But it does anchor the Americans still a little bit in Europe for some time, so it can't totally focus on China's aggression and coercion and everything else it's doing in the Pacific. Clearly, the trade relationship and what makes from this war has increased since 2022. It's got a source of much cheaper energy than it might have had otherwise from Russia. And at the end of the day, it's turning Russia into a country that depends on it. I don't think it turns Russia into a client state. I don't believe it goes that far. But it is certainly turning Russia into a state that is more dependent on China than it's ever been before. And that's all to China's advantage.
How much use does China see in the war as being a test bed, though, also for any future conflict in the Pacific?
Yeah, it's clearly observing the war very closely. The Chinese have a very long history of observing and learning from other people's wars. They looked at the Falklands War very closely. And if you have a look at it, a long-distance expeditionary operation to take back an island, that's exactly what the Americans might have to do for Taiwan. They studied the Gulf Wars very closely, the aerial campaigns over the former Yugoslavia, and more recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, not just for the technologies of war, but how Western military organizations function as systems, how they command and control. And since 2022, the Chinese have been watching this war, not just how drones and other things impact warfare, but how NATO, how the US administration makes decisions about these kind of conflicts to inform how China might make decisions in a future conflict over Taiwan.
And what do you think they have actually learnt from this?
Well, I think they've learned quite a few lessons. They've learned about nuclear saber rattling and the threshold for NATO and Western action when that kind of saber rattling occurs. They've clearly learned a lot about new technologies and the very, very profound impact of uncrewed systems in the air, on the land, and at sea. I think they've learned a lot about deterrence and the theories of deterrence in the modern world. And I think another big lesson, and I'll wrap up with this one because there's lots of others, but I think they've learned a lot about misinformation and the strategic influence of Western populations. I mean, there's a great old movie, The Usual Suspects, and there's a quote in there that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was to convince us he didn't exist. That's exactly what China's doing to Western populations, to try and convince us all it is not a threat.
Do you see any evidence at the moment that China is actually trying to probe NATO allies to see how they might react to China put into the scenario that it sees in Ukraine, if it were to have to come into some kind of potential conflict situation? Do you see it actually pushing the boundaries that we've seen sometimes with Putin's Russia doing with Europe and NATO allies?
Well, certainly China uses diplomacy very actively to try and shape perceptions and collect information on Western decision-making. I mean, we see this continuously in Australia. The Chinese at the moment are working very hard to split Australia from its closest ally, the United States. I mean, they're just doing so much diplomatically and in the information space and economically to do that. And they want to try and do the same between Europe and America. It's in their interests to deal with individual countries, not large, powerful, rich alliances like NATO or alliances like the Australia-Japan-US relationship in the Pacific. So this is something they're doing constantly, but they don't just work on diplomats or government people. They work on populations to try and have them convince politicians that they shouldn't be focusing on China.
And militarily, what ideas or concepts do you think China is interested in using in any potential attempt to invade Taiwan that it's looking at in Ukraine?
Well, I think there's a few. Clearly, they would like to ensure there's no Taiwanese version of Zelensky. I mean, the profound impact of Zelensky's leadership, particularly in the first days and weeks of the war, in unifying people and really energizing NATO and other Western countries into assisting Ukraine. The Chinese will have a very robust plan to decapitate Taiwanese leadership to prevent that happening, as well as break down the cohesion of Taiwan's defense. I think they will be watching Russia's long-range strike programs, as well as Ukraine's long-range strike programs into Russia, for what's made them work, what has hindered those kind of operations, because that will inevitably be an early part of any campaign against Taiwan or indeed any of the rest of us in the Pacific. They will have watched and learned from the quality of military forces on both sides, particularly the declining quality of the Russians, and will try and address that in their own military forces. And then obviously the impact of autonomous systems. The US Indo-PACOM has the concept called Hellscape, which is essentially the Ukrainian drone line across the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese will be looking at, well, how do they penetrate that? But secondly, how might they set up their own drone line on the eastern side of Taiwan to prevent assistance to Taiwan in a contingency?
It's all very fascinating stuff. And if you were to make a direct comparison with the early 2000s, when China seized the opportunity to modernize its military and expand in the South China Sea while the US was preoccupied with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, how is it progressing now?
Well, I think the high point of that US distraction is over. Clearly, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are over. The Trump administration is shifting its attention away from Europe in a way previous administrations haven't. So the US is far more focused on the Pacific, in particular North Asia and the Western Pacific, in a way that it hasn't been for a very long time. So the Chinese will be desperate to find ways to distract Europe and America elsewhere in the world. because as the Americans shift more of their forces, more of their investment, more of their intelligence collection, more of their economic power into the Pacific, it will become increasingly difficult for the Chinese to achieve their strategic objectives, which is to dominate the entirety of the western part of the Pacific.
What about North Korea? It's also building its experience on the battlefield and pledging thousands more troops to the war effort for Putin. What kind of long-term regional implications do you think are being considered from where you are about their involvement in the war?
Yeah, I think the North Koreans, with the provision of munitions and troops, have had an impact on Putin's war against Ukraine. But the most profound impact is probably the exporting of North Korea's lessons in Ukraine and Russia back to the Korean Peninsula, where the North Koreans have 1 million troops. And if you have 1 million troops that improve in quality by 1 or 2% with hundreds of thousands of drones, which the Russians are helping them to establish factories to build, that changes the correlation of forces on the Korean Peninsula. That's unhealthy, not just for the South Koreans and the Americans that are based there, but stability more generally in North Asia. So I think the biggest impact of North Korea's assistance to Russia will be in Korea and will be in the Western Pacific.
And how much nervousness is there from where you're speaking from Australia about this?
Well, I think most people are more nervous about China. I mean, China is the big panda in the room. I mean, it's hard to discuss regional or global security without discussing China. But in some respects, it's very different to Europe. You have to deal with Russia. We have to deal with China, North Korea, and Russia, which also has a Pacific fleet and a Pacific presence. So there's a triumvirate in the Western Pacific. They work together. They conduct joint patrols. The Russians and Chinese do that. The Chinese clearly help the North Koreans. So in a contingency, for example, the Senkakus or Taiwan, it's very easy to imagine that the Russians might do something and the North Koreans might do something to split the focus of the Americans and its allies in the Western Pacific.
In terms of the American focus, President Zelensky is just in the process of conducting a reshuffle. He's appointed his choice for new defence minister was the Prime Minister. What do you think of this reshuffle now, and what do you think it will achieve?
Well, he's chosen people who know how to work with the Americans. The new Prime Minister led the development of the joint agreement on the exploitation of Ukrainian minerals. So, I mean, she is conversant with this administration and how they make decisions, how they negotiate. The new ambassador to the United States is likely to be the current defense minister, Minister Umerov, replacing a Ukrainian ambassador who the Republicans have made their displeasure about clearly. So Zelensky's clearly lining up his ducks to have a better relationship, a closer relationship with the Trump administration, which is going to be there for another 3.5 years, which is going to be a very decisive time for Ukraine. So, I think Zelensky has learned and adapted after that 28 February meeting in the White House, which, appalled all of us. But I think this is a natural and common sense evolution in their relationship with the Americans.
And do you think this is a decisive moment for the Donald Trump-Putin relationship? Because you wrote that there may well be a showdown actually looming, but it could actually just be a climb down by Donald Trump.
Yeah, there's a reason why the US president has that nickname Taco, that, he escalates and then de-escalates. We saw this with Canada, Mexico, and other relationships. My sense is Putin's a bit different, notwithstanding the admiration that Trump has expressed for him in the past. Putin has really humiliated Trump in the last few months. And, we've seen important relationships to Trump break down just in the last few months with Elon Musk. So, it's very foreseeable. You could see a breakdown in the relationship between Trump and Putin, and Trump, doubling down on the support to Ukraine. Now, it's still talk at this point in time, and there's a lot of water to go under the bridge. But once we see additional action from the US administration, it's Trump's administration, we'll have a better sense of where that Putin-Trump relationship is headed.
And if this is not a big moment, as the NATO Secretary General said it was, there is an alternative proposed now by two former defence ministers of Ukraine, and that is to keep the Russians fighting as long as they want to, or as long as they do, just stop them from making any progress, but meanwhile build up Ukraine, survive and function. And they call this kind of strategic neutralisation. Do you think this is a realistic possibility, and how can it be done?
I mean, it sounds nice in an academic paper, but the reality of war is, I mean, you may have one strategy to keep the Russians fighting at minimal cost to you, but it rarely works out like that because the Russians also get a vote. They understand war too. And if they're going to hurt, they're going to want to make Ukraine hurt too, just as they have in the last 3.5 years. War is rarely as tidy as they have hoped for in that paper. I think it's still going to be quite brutal and bloody over the next few years as the Ukrainians seek to increase the level of attrition they impose on the Russians, but the Russians are still going to hurt Ukraine as well, unfortunately.
So you said the next few years you really are expecting this war to continue for several years to come?
Unless Ukraine wins quickly. I mean, the Ukrainians are not going to surrender to Russia. I mean, everything that Putin has done, from nuclear saber rattling to the horrendous thousands and thousands of war crimes to his demands about the subjugation of Ukraine, means that the Ukrainians just aren't going to surrender, because as bad as it is to fight Putin, it would be even worse to be occupied by him. So things look grim at the moment in some respects, but it's nowhere near as grim as it is for those Ukrainians who are currently in occupied territories.
Mick Ryan, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.